Again, 2 years ago, I was here talking about shells, but in a rather convoluted fashion. I realized that for many of you, shells in the past, in the distant past, is something that cannot be directly related to Falah or the Falah Consortium and people's interests. So this is the fruit of a lot of thinking, a lot of discipline, and hopefully it'll be a little bit more interesting to most of you, rather than talk exclusively about archaeology. Can switch? Wait, I have my own. Which is forward, which is backward. Ça va? Oh. Comme ça? How come it worked for Gilbert? It doesn't seem to work for me. Okay. So, while we get started, is where I'm picking up where I left off, beginning right here in New Caledonia. So, move forward. So I decided to present under 4 topics, the consolidation of ideas through secondment and my own personal thinking and publications. So first we'll look at reef gleaning, and here specifically focusing on shellfish, bivalves, and gastropods. A brief overview of nutritional data or lack of data. Something I prefer not to get into too much, that was my mistake 2 years ago, human behavioral ecology. For many of you, this is probably familiar. It's still somewhat controversial, so I will not get into that too much. But I will make an argument, hopefully, that it has some application, potential application, when we look at mollusk harvesting. And finally, the issue of overharvesting and climate change. Okay, food security. Well, this is tilapia. I think it's, no, milkfish. So I just wanted to illustrate that food security is not just about shells, but about anything. These are the shells. All right, so yeah, it's the primary source of lean protein and other nutrients in the Pacific Islands. We're one of the highest consumers of fish and shellfish in the world. On the other hand, compared to finfish, reef gleaning opportunities have been somewhat neglected by researchers and government agencies. The work of women is usually underappreciated, but let's face it, we have come a long way compared to 20, 30 years ago. Within that dimension, we need to look more closely at traditional and local knowledge. I will not get into that. And finally, this tied in with point number 2, the perception that mollusk harvesting involves limited skills and a little bit of understanding of environmental cues. Again, we won't have time to go into that in great detail in this conference. Okay, topic number 2, thank you, my colleagues. Good timing. Nutritional data. So here is from the market. First trip I took with Christophe, and I'm just a shell man. They called me the shell man, and I was absolutely astounded by the bigorneux, which I think is, it's not trochus, it's turbo. And on this side is Strombus luanus. I think the terminology has changed somewhat. So let's look at the nutritional data. Marine resources, of course, a source of lean meat, lean protein, micronutrients, omega-3 fatty acids, et cetera, and there's a deficiency in the region. One thing I'd like to point out, and hopefully I will be able to pursue before I retire, is the fact that we need a lot more data, nutritional data, particularly for micronutrients, for different shellfish taxa or species. If you look at a nutritional table, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'd like to learn more about that. Bivalves and gastropods, although in some cases species are mentioned, they are lumped. So we have relatively little data on the nutritional value, micronutrients, and also macronutrients for a variety of shellfish. And this is just looking at Indo-Pacific taxa. Okay. So deficiencies on the global scale, these nutritional deficiencies affects about 10% of the global population, but of course the data is not very accurate. All those risks, which I will not enumerate here. I'll say a few words about that. This is a familiar slide. I always show that at presentations. Okay, so aquaculture among traditional societies, we have evidence that this goes back some time. And until relatively recently, local communities did practice small-scale aquaculture or mariculture projects involving shellfish. Now, we're more familiar with shrimp farms and finfish. Shrimp farms are a big problem, as I mentioned here. Pollution, it's usually targeted to wealthy consumers, and there are problems with antibiotics and chemical discharge. So, if we look at the aquaculture of shells, particularly giant clams, this is something that is going on, has been going on for some time to replete depleted stocks in the wild, but also to foster local markets for the sell in local markets. But then this is being overshadowed by a high demand for the aquarium trade, and specifically for giant clams, tridacnids. The third problem, and this not only affecting aquaculture and shellfish, is the fact that many fishing communities are being encouraged to find other forms of livelihood because of declining stocks and so forth. The problem with that is distances the communities from customary marine tenure and ultimately linked to the problems, the ongoing problems of food security. Okay, number 3, mollusk harvesting. Okay, again, I don't want to go into too much detail. We can talk about that later. The big question is, at the subsistence level or semi-subsistence level, are people actually targeting species, or is it random? Now, if you look at a catch, a typical random catch, no pun intended, you would say, well, one of the strengths of Pacific Island communities back then and even now is the fact that they target multi-species. Is that really the case? Now, I'm not going to talk too much about commercial harvesting of shellfish. So it took me a while to put this together. If you're not familiar with human behavioral ecology, it might be a little bit more complicated to understand, but I'm using a behavioral ecological approach to understand shellfish harvesting. It's an approach, it's a theoretical approach, which involves models with hypotheses to be tested. And these are called foraging models. So we're looking at a currency, usually net caloric intake. Now, of course, we can substitute micronutrients, protein, and whatnot. But let's look at energy, which is a very simple calorie. So we're looking at the amount of energy expended in searching for shellfish, harvesting them, and processing them, versus in this case, energy being acquired, all right? Resources in foraging models are ranked, and it's based on the assumption that foragers will harvest those taxa or species that provide the highest return per unit of time. For example, doesn't take a genius to realize that, the larger species or the largest individual of species. And we look at the archaeological record, as Christophe Sand explained 2 years ago, you usually have the larger specimens, and then there's a decline, perhaps because of climate change, because of overharvesting. We'll get into that in a moment. So that's essentially the background that I'm using to try to understand how people decide what taxa or what species to collect. Okay, I think I'll jump over this. Again, I'm focusing here on subsistence and semi-subsistence, thank you, Catherine, semi-subsistence harvesting of mollusks. So the question is it really random or is it targeted? Because if you look at commercial harvesting, you would say it's definitely targeted. All right. So if you look at a typical catch, you would say, well, there's a variety of shellfish. But if shellfish, based on the assumption that you would collect the highest ranking shellfish based on energy expended versus energy acquired, you might say, well, if there's a decline in those species, then your diet breadth would actually expand. You take the less desirable individual, in this case, the mollusks, all right? So, you know, I've been challenged, we have been challenged, those who espouse behavioral ecology, that, yes, obviously people have food preferences. I would not deny that. But in response, I would say what we prefer may not necessarily mean this is what we consume regularly. Like the old adage in anthropology, what people do and what people say can be vastly different. Okay, finally, the question of overharvesting. I'd like to thank colleagues who provided feedback on the abstract. Talk a little bit about that. So overharvesting and climate change are obviously constraints that are a lot more significant than changes in tidal cycles and storminess. They're talking about large-scale and long-term changes in many cases. Two classic examples, Hippopus hippopus and Tridacna gigas, the latter more so than the former. There are instances, including right here in New Caledonia, that it appears that before European contact, Tridacna gigas became locally extinct. In Fiji, we have the same thing, plus we have Hippopus hippopus. To say that it occurred during Lapita times, we can't be certain. And of course, there could have been isolated populations that persisted for a while. What's interesting, and maybe this is something that Christophe and I can take up later on, is that when you talk about climate change, let's not forget that climate change is not necessarily higher temperatures and rising sea levels. In this case, there's a PhD student that I'm supervising at USP. She's actually based in Australia, is that she hypothesizes, and we have environmental proxies to support that, that we have evidence of lowering sea levels in the Southwest Pacific about 2,500 years ago, which may have contributed not only to the decline of reef resources, including giant clams, but may have had a role to play in the ultimate, I don't want to use demise, but in the ultimate transformation of Lapita. But I don't want to talk about that this afternoon. All right, so what are we looking at nowadays? 2 minutes left, I guess. Undeniably, we have commercial exploitation of mollusks as a cause of, main cause of decline. Global warming, of course, we have that. Habitat change, more constraints on harvesting. And as I mentioned a moment ago, perhaps what we're seeing, it's kind of counterintuitive as well. When you have an expansion in your diet in terms of species selection, you might say, well, things are going well. Well, not really, because if you select the smaller individual of your preferred species or smaller species, you're expanding your diet. And of course, if you encounter high-rank resources, you would obviously pick them up. Hence, a possible explanation, a very likely explanation for so-called multi-species harvesting, which have been somewhat deceiving us. That is, if you espouse the tenets of human behavioral ecology. So, with climate change, with habitat alteration and so forth, this is a hypothesis. We can expect the diet breadth to expand. Low-ranked species, again, here based on energy rather than micronutrients and macronutrients, low-ranked species may acquire greater importance. They will figure more prominently in a catch, and we're already seeing this. And yeah, and this could be tested. This is a hypothesis that we are testing. I've done this in Kiribati many years ago by looking at time motion studies and, of course, the various predictions of foraging models. There are many of them. And finally, based on these findings, we may need, again, coming back to theme number 2, we definitely need more nutritional information on those species that are now acquiring more importance, even though people may not necessarily prefer them. As Gilbert pointed out, tilapia may not be the favorite fare on everybody's plate here in the Pacific, but basically we have no choice, but obviously for different reasons. So I think, yeah, references if you're interested, and thank you.
Thank you, Frank, for the time also. Is there any comments or questions in the room? Yes?
Yes, David.
Please.
That's a really interesting talk. Thanks, Frank. I was wondering whether you'd get a different perspective on the system if you used protein rather than energy as a currency, because protein, after all, is a resource most closely associated with mollusk foraging rather than energy per se.
Okay, it sounds like PhD defense when I had committee members who could not accept the fact that I was using calories. You know, shellfish are rich in protein. Yes, perhaps I haven't tested for that, but as I responded during my defense, I don't think I'm comparing apples and oranges. I'm comparing energy within a category called mollusks. So obviously to calculate energy, I had to calculate protein, carbohydrates, and fatty acids, right? And based on that, I was looking at my own time motion studies, also interviewing people, so you have to do both. And that's a good question, David. If I had used a different currency, I may have come up with different results. The beauty of foraging models is that you are testing hypotheses, and if by testing it, it fits the predictions of those hypotheses, it says model tested. But there were obviously other models that I had to test. Diet breath is one of them. There's a lot of variables depending on the experience of foragers. You may have children, elderly people, stormy conditions, the time where you actually head out on the reef and come back. It may be high tide by then, and so on and so forth. So, good question. I don't know. And it's something that we should definitely test.
It might not matter just to the extent that protein might correlate that well with energy in mollusks that they're effectively one and the same thing for predictive purposes. On the other hand, mollusks have rich stores of glycogen, which are carbohydrate.
Yes.
So there might be substantial variation in the ratio of protein to other sources of energy, especially seasonally.
Yes, yes. Good question. Thank you.
George.
Thank you.
Yes, George.
Thanks very much, Frank. I've got two quick questions. One is, have you noticed with population growth and increasing pressure on these, do the tenure systems get tighter over reef resources? Do they become more exclusive to sort of preserve a declining stock?
It depends what Pacific Island country. In deference to my colleagues from the Solomons, I think marine tenure there is a lot more stringent. I know a colleague of mine, not a colleague, we were classmates at UH Manoa. He did his PhD on optimal foraging, I think ultimately looking at shellfish in Roviana Lagoon. So marine tenure is very strictly observed in some countries and some communities. In Kiribati, yeah, I mean, you can, I guess, blame the former colonial administration for the breakdown of marine tenure. Now, there have been efforts since then of reviving them locally, but it all depends, George. I mean, there's a great deal of variability in Pacific Island communities. In Fiji, yes, we had Ngoli, but that also contributed to the coup that... there was a coup, among other reasons, because the prime minister was actually an ardent defendant of not just Fijian rights, Itauke rights, but the principle of marine tenure. It's a lot more complex than that. But there's a great deal of variability.
Somebody else wants to ask a question. I can jump.
Sorry.
Hi, Frank. Thank you for the presentation. Very interesting on the foraging models. I may have missed, but was there a variable that you also tested relating to the health of the ecosystem, which equates to the diversity of the species that they can find?
Thank you, Hilda. That's a dimension that I did not explore. Otherwise, I'd be talking for hours. The relationship of that in relation to marine conservation, right? It's a dimension that I did not really explore in my research. My colleague who did research in Solomons did look at that. So in this presentation, I was not looking at the impacts other than the impacts on the resources themselves. Did I answer your question? Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thanks. This ecological behavioral models, it's very interesting. And I was just thinking, because it's energy return from the foraging.
Yes.
But if somebody's selling the shellfish like trochus shell or something like that, or bêche de mer, and they're using those funds to buy food, protein, does that, can you accommodate that within the model? So they're selling what they're harvesting from the reef and then using the money to buy protein.
Quite sure if I understand your question, but foraging models can be applied to any monetary system, whether it's commercial, whether it's artisanal or semi-subsistence. So your question is the money that a harvester would be getting from selling his or her catch? Would that person be optimizing something? Yeah? Yes, yeah, it would. It would, obviously. I mean, if there's a high demand for, let's say here, trokka or trochus is very popular, a forager would obviously channel his or her energy in collecting a portion of the harvest for sale. So that's what we call targeting. Yeah, but from another perspective, I guess the beauty of foraging models is that it is testable and yeah.